Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm hopefully going to give you guys a fairly quick update on a couple of the guns that I've been testing lately. We're going to revisit the StARpion, and we're also going to take another look at the GF4 from Palmetto State Armory. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the StARpion is just a Stribog that has an A3 tactical lower on it. I call it a StARpion because it has some Stribog parts, it has some AR parts, and of course the whole reason for getting the whole new lower on it was so that it could take CZ Scorpion magazines. So Stribog, ARs, CZ Scorpion, StARpion. That's where that name came from. Where I left off last with my review of this thing is that I had said that with the new lower on there and using the PSA magazines as well as the original 30-round CZ factory magazines, it seemed to run pretty good on pretty much all of the common bulk ammo that was out there. And that remains true. I did say that I wasn't up to the point of replacing my CZ Scorpion with it, though, although the two guns are very similar in terms of kind of the niche that they fill. But I didn't feel confident in replacing my CZ Scorpion with this thing just yet because I hadn't tested it with any defensive ammo. Well, I have done that recently. I've actually done that on the past couple of outings with this thing, and frankly the results were not good. Now, it is just a test of one single type of defensive ammo that needs to be considered here, but every time that I've put my defensive ammo through this thing, which has just been Federal Punch 124 grain, every time I've put it through this gun, I've always gotten at least one malfunction that day. And it's always been with those defensive rounds, with the punch ammunition. And both of the times that I went out, there's only had 2 times that I've reviewed it with that ammunition, only 2 times that I've tried putting that ammunition through it, and it failed both times. Both times were technically failures to feed. One of them was kind of the Stribog doing its thing that it used to do before I got the new lower on it, which is it would kind of feed the round up kind of a weird angle and kind of get jammed in there sideways. That's kind of a typical thing for Stribogs. If it doesn't happen to load right, it'll kind of get wedged in there in a weird way. And that happened the first time, though. The round actually did go into the chamber, but it was sticking out a good way and the bolt wouldn't close all the way. And so I tried to extract the round. It wasn't coming out. It was stuck tight, and eventually did get the bolt to close on it, but still couldn't get it to open. Wound up firing that round that didn't feed properly, and that eventually allowed it to cycle out. And it caused this weird thing where the bolt would actually kind of hang up for a little while after that happened. Put some more of my regular plinking ammunition through it, and I mean very run-of-the-mill stuff. The Wolf copper plated stuff, the Tula 115 grain stuff, very, very, very common, very pedestrian plinking ammo, and then the gun returned to normal function, and now it doesn't have that hiccup anymore. The bolt comes home just fine, like it did when it was brand new, basically. It was kind of a weird little thing. Put the defensive rounds through it, and the bolt got really sluggish, and it failed to feed it properly. Take that out, put some more rounds through it, let the gun cool off a little bit, put some more rounds through it, just regular plinking stuff later, and it returned to normal function. So in terms of where I am in evaluating this thing, I'm going to maintain my original premise that the Stribog is, in general, especially in the A3 version, not particularly good. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad gun or that it won't work for you or anything like that, but I'm just saying that there are better options out there for serious use applications. The A3 version, which is what I have right here, is particularly problematic just because it tends to be more finicky than the A1 version of the Stribog. The A1 version of the Stribog actually ran pretty well, and there's another one of those that we have in our testing, me and a couple of other people that have been doing the rounds on these things. They have the A1 version, I have the A3 version, and their A1 version is running great. They have had no significant issues whatsoever after they put their A3 tactical lower on theirs. However, I still occasionally have issues with mine, most recently with this Federal Punch ammunition. Like I said, that's just one kind of defensive ammo. I get that. Might not be indicative of what it does with other stuff, and you might be able to find a different defensive load that works. But I contrast that with the A1 version that they have, and that thing never chokes. With the new lower on it from A3 Tactical, that thing runs like a champ, and this thing does really well with ball rounds, with round nose ammunition. Doesn't seem to like hollow points so far. Like I said, I only had the one kind of test, and it's kind of hard to get too much defensive ammunition these days, especially in any kind of quantity, you know, based on my budget and what prices are doing. But yeah, that was the first couple of tests that we had with defensive ammunition in this thing, and it choked. Like I said, both outings, the Federal Punch did not feed properly. One of them, like I said, was a really weird feeding thing where it wouldn't go all the way into battery, and when I finally did get it in battery, then it didn't want to come back out until I had to fire the round to actually get it to come back out. That was weird. And then the other one was kind of a normal misfeed where it just kind of went up at a weird angle and got stuck there. You pull back on the bolt a little bit and the round falls out. You know, it's not a huge deal, but the first one was very bizarre. But yeah, I maintain my original premise. The A3 version of the Stribog is not going to be your best bet in terms of being able to run different kinds of ammunition. They just tend to be more sensitive. The A1 is a better version. And in terms of practical use, my CZ StARpion still beats these things. These things have better ergonomics, they're a little bit lighter, etc., etc. There's a lot to say for the Stribog, but reliability when it counts is not something I've been overly impressed with, at least on the Stribog SP9A3. A1 is a little bit different story. That one I would be a little bit more confident with, especially, you know, I would always suggest with any gun that you have before you rely on it for defensive use, that you always want to test it with your defensive ammo on multiple occasions preferred. The old standard used to be to do at least 200 rounds of your defensive ammo. That's really hard to do these days, but I would say at least multiple outings, multiple magazines, if you can. And like I said, the A3 version tends to be a little bit finicky, and I know that this particular one with this particular lower doesn't like to feed the Federal Punch. So I'd be very cautious about that. With any gun, always make sure that you test it first. But so far in our testing, the A3 version of the Stribog is not a particularly good gun in general, just because it tends to be fairly finicky. The A1, the SP9A1, is much better, and the CZ StARpion beats both of them in terms of raw reliability. The StARpions, and I'm talking about the Evo 3 S1, not the Plus version. I haven't had my hands on the Plus version. I don't know how it would perform or not. I would imagine very similarly, although the fact that it has to take a different magazine kind of bums me out, and I'm not all that interested in it right now. But the old school, not all that old, but the older version of the CZ StARpion, the Evo 3 S1, rocks in terms of reliability. Not the greatest ergonomics in the world, I freely admit that, and there are some issues that can come up, especially when bump firing and using certain kinds of ammunition. I've talked about that in past videos, but in general, it will feed a much wider range of ammo, and it will cycle that ammunition correctly. It fires off correctly. It's just in general a much more reliable system. So I'm not saying you can't use the Stribog defensively if you want to. What I'm saying is that I am not going to be using this A3 soon. Now, if I get some more defensive ammo in, and I have enough extra of it to go through another round of testing with this thing, and if it does happen to feed that correctly and reliable, and I am able to bring it on multiple outings, and you know, that kind of thing, get the gun real dirty, and then put the defensive ammo in it and see if it still works and all that kind of thing, go through a series of tests and it does work with that ammo, then I might. Although I would be still a little bit hesitant to have a defensive gun that only works with, you know, one kind of defensive ammunition, if that's the way that it winds up being. So all that to say, I'm still hesitant about it. Now the GF4, on the other hand, has been a little bit of a different story. The GF4 was my attempt to basically get a whole lot of features for a relatively low price. I mentioned before that this one is actually a little bit of a cut down version. It only has a 14.7-inch barrel on it with a pinned and welded muzzle device to bring it up to the legally required 16 inches for a true rifle. I mentioned that it has this nice JL billet rail on here. My opinion of this has definitely changed. Originally I thought it was a pretty good thing. Now I'm kind of nah, I'll talk about that. It also had a hinged and railed dust cover to hold the optics, and I had this system on here of the dual optics set up, you know, with the little flip to side magnifier for the red dot and all that, and I thought that would be cool. My opinion has changed on that, and it had the really cool traditional triangle side folding brace. My opinion has definitely changed on that. But like I said, it was basically my attempt to get a whole lot of features in a relatively low-cost package. And in terms of the value of the overall package, I'm not greatly disappointed in. But my images in my own head of what I had for this gun didn't really turn to work out. First, let's talk about the rail. The rail in the initial testing came loose. And that was a pity, because when I first looked at it, I thought it was installed correctly, and it looked like it had been installed correctly enough. But that was not the case. Turns out that there was basically no Loctite, no thread locker on it at all. And so yeah, it worked itself loose after about 40 rounds or so. And so that time I took it apart, reset all the set screws. I thought I applied a sufficient amount of Loctite to the appropriate screws, because it does have some set screws in the back and a couple in the front. There's one in the back and two in the front, and then there are of course the tightening screws all around the sides. And those I don't really feel like they need Loctite, but it wouldn't be the worst idea ever to have it on there. But anyways, the second time that I redid it and applied Loctite as I thought appropriately, it still managed to come loose. So that's starting to get a little bit frustrating. The most recent time that I took it out, it actually has not come loose, but there is a little bit of play, and I basically did that intentionally. I upped the amount of Loctite that I applied to the set screws, like gobs of it, and I intentionally left it just a little bit loose so that the action of the gun would be a little bit delayed in how it would act on the rail, and that seems to have solved the problem. Like I said, it is a little bit loose, but it hasn't worked itself further loose. Now, the fact that it is a little loose, though, you can hear it. The fact that it is a little loose, though, means that it's probably not going to be a great place to mount optics or IR lasers or anything like that. That kind of ruins the whole purpose of the JL billet rail. This is supposed to be the forced alignment rail, and not really succeeding in that regard. Like, it works just fine as a handguard. I'm perfectly fine with it that way. But in terms of it being a reliable mounting solution, because, like I said, I had to leave it a little bit loose to keep it from becoming further loose, well, like I said, that kind of defeats the purpose. So, as a mounting option for optics and optics-related accessories, it's a fail in my opinion. Is it a nice handguard? Yes. Will it work as a handguard? Yes. Is it worth the like $200 that they would charge you individually for it? I personally don't think so. Other people may have, you know, different mileage with it and have better success than I have, but like I said, I've had it come loose 2 times this past time. It didn't come loose because I left it a little loose. That was kind of my workaround for it. And like I said, I applied gobs of Loctite to this thing to keep it from moving any more than it does. So I'm just not overly enthralled with it. Now, maybe if it was installed properly from the factory, maybe I wouldn't have had an issue with it, but it is what it is. Like I said, it works fine as a handguard, but in terms of being a great optics mounting option, it's probably going to depend on the quality of the install itself. If PSA does it, PSA is kind of infamous for sometimes doing a good job on their handguards and sometimes completely screwing it up. And in this case, when I looked it over for the first time, I thought everything was nice and solid. I believed wholeheartedly that it was properly installed, and that turns out not to have been correct. So damn on me for not testing it a little bit more rigorously before actually firing it. And then the railed dust cover was one of the major selling points of this rifle for me, and to be honest, the railed dust cover thing in the past has not worked out super great for me, just because these railed dust covers can be a little bit loose, and you can even hear that. Yeah, that's the dust cover. It's a little bit loose. It wobbles around a little bit. Now, like I said, in the past that's been an issue for me, but on this one, that actually didn't turn out to be the major issue. It might be an issue, but it certainly isn't the biggest issue. I've been trying to get this gun zeroed for quite a while now, and it has just not wanted to behave. Originally, I had the red dot set further up on the rail, and the theory being that the closer you are to the hinge that basically replaces the rear sight block. The theory being that the closer you are to the hinge, the less deviation you're going to experience as a result of it being a hinged top cover. And so that's how I tried it out at first, and of course I had the magnifier in the back because there's a certain amount of eye relief that you have to have, so you do have to mount it a little bit further back. That was not working. I would have just the red dot by itself with the magnifier flipped over, use the red dot, and I would get a somewhat decent group, not great. With red dots, I'm really not all that great. I have astigmatism and some other eye issues now because of some of the medications that I take for health issues and that kind of stuff, and that's a long, boring story. But long story short, I don't work very well with red dots. For me, red dots are very much so an up-close thing. They're very convenient up close, but I'm terrible at distance with them. About 50 yards, I can still usually hold a decent group. At a 100 yards, I'm oftentimes struggling to keep everything on an 8-inch plate, and past 100 yards with a red dot, I'm practically useless. Like I said, 100 yards is a lot of times a stretch, and sometimes 50 yards is a little bit difficult. But with the red dot, I was doing okay. And then I would flip the magnifier over when the red dot was all the way up, and my groups would actually suddenly get worse, which is really, really, really weird for me, because for me, normally when I add magnification, that takes care of a lot of the astigmatism issues and stuff like that. And so I'm sitting there going, well, that is really bizarre. And so I brought the red dot back closer to the magnifier, and I also upgraded the magnifier. This is now one of the Holosun magnifiers. Before, I had one of the primary arms magnifiers, and it was literally the cheapest magnifier that I could find. And at the time I'm thinking, well, if the magnifier is making my groups worse, maybe it's just a crummy magnifier. We'll get rid of that. We'll put something that's a little bit better. It's not top quality at all, but a little bit better quality, and that's why I have the Holosun on there. And my groups did improve, but it was still the case that when the magnifier was employed, it was worse than just the red dot by itself. And so that kind of was a little bit disillusioning for me, because I was hoping that this system of magnifier and red dot would be a really great combo for the AK, but as it turns out, the system didn't work because of the triangle folding stock that I really wanted. It's a very traditional AK folding stock. It's very classic. It's very iconic. You know, it's one of those things that you look at and know, you know, that's just that is AK through and through. The problem, though, is that this stock is very thin and a little uncomfortable, and that's why I wound up putting the bumper pad on the back of it. Because I like a little bit more cushion, but it's still very thin on top, and of course there is absolutely no cheek riser on this at all. And so between where your cheek would naturally rest and the line of sight through the optic system is horrible, and you have your head on it and it kind of wind up kind of bouncing around a little bit to try to find your place, and eventually you wind up with kind of this chin hold thing. And frankly, it doesn't work very well. There were some, I won't call them groups, but I'll call them subgroups. Now, if I fired 5 or 10 rounds, which would be a pretty good group, about half of the rounds, a little less than half, we'll say around 40%. About 40% of the rounds would just go in weird random directions and wouldn't be very useful at all, frankly. But a little bit more than half of the rounds were actually grouping rather well. Initially I used the Wolf 123 grain polyformate stuff, which isn't particularly great. I think that was one of the Russian made batches. It's not particularly great ammo, and so, you know, groups not being particularly good with low quality ammo. I was like, okay, maybe it's just kind of an ammo thing, and so I upgraded to what was that? Some of the Arsenal ammo. Arsenal actually makes ammo, I found out. 7.62x39 ammo. It makes sense. But they do have an ammo that is out there. It's 122 grain. And I actually found it to be pretty decent stuff. But, and with it, the main cluster, the subgroup that I'm talking about, would actually be really tight. At 50 yards, I could usually put it inside of 3/4 of an inch for the subgroup. Like I said, the group as a whole was usually pretty awful because around 40% of the rounds would just fly off in random directions. But that subgroup, that 60% subgroup, it would be tight. Like I said, a lot of times within 3/4 of an inch at 50 yards, which is roughly, 1.5 inches at 100 yards, so roughly 1.5 MOA. That's perfectly acceptable for an AK. But like I said, there was that 40% of the rounds that were just off in weird random places. And the reason for that was that I could not keep a consistent chin weld on this thing. It's not a problem that everyone is going to have. I understand that. Just with the way that my eyes work, like I said, there's issues beyond just the astigmatism. And if I can't have a real steady hold, I don't get consistent shots. And so, like I said, I was able to do pretty good about 60% of the time, and the other 40% of the time, I might be on targets, I might be near the targets, usually at least near. I mean, it wasn't so bad as to be like dangerous to people who are nearby. It's always going to go into the target or the backstop, but it was still a lot less consistent than I would prefer. And so, where I am with this gun is saying that with me, this is not something that I'm going to be accurate long range if I leave the stock in its current configuration. The problem, though, is to get a real good stock with a really nice cheek comb on it. A lot of those that I've looked at, that's like $120 to $200 minimum to get that changed out. And frankly, I just don't have that kind of money to spend on it. What would be a lot simpler is just simply to take all of the extras here off, and of course this red dot here is one of the ones that has the holdover marks on it. What is that? It is the 503G from Holosun, and so it has a little chevron and 3 dots underneath for elevation holds. It's a really great little red dot, a really nice magnifier, but like I said, because I'm kind of bouncing around behind this thing all the time, I just can't keep a consistent enough hold to actually make it useful. So what I'm going to do is take this stuff off, replace it with just a simple low mounted red dots, and basically use it as a close quarters gun. In terms of reliability, it has been excellent. I have put soft points through this thing, the bulk soft points that you at least used to be able to get. I haven't seen them on the market for a while, but I broke out a few packages and put those through. It wasn't a ton. I think it was like 20 or 40 rounds, something like that, but enough to see if it would work, and in fact it did. And I actually even used the AK-103 magazine that PSA makes, and it was actually a little hard to load with the soft points. I wound up having to unload it at one point and reload it because they weren't feeding properly, but when it came time to fire, they all worked perfectly fine, even in a magazine that they were a little iffy on trying to get them into. So no malfunctions with the soft points, no malfunctions with the Wolf 123 grain, no malfunctions with the Arsenal 122 grain. I also had some Tula 122 grain in there as well, and probably a mixture of some other things along the way, and it does not have any problems with it. I've actually been really impressed with the action on this thing. Like I said, I can't hit anything at distance worth beans because I'm doing the little head bob thing, but in terms of reliability, this thing has been awesome, and I'm really impressed with these folding stock receivers. Normally on the non-folding stock receivers from PSA, there's usually not quite enough clearance between the trigger mech and the bolt carrier. In the past, I've had to do some file work on both surfaces to get them to mate well, and I've shown that in previous videos. But on this one, I didn't have to do any extra work whatsoever, and it just runs beautifully. I really, really, really enjoy the action. It is a very smooth, reliable shooter. There's no doubt about that. just because of the triangle folding stock that I wanted so badly. And in trying to run a system like this where you have, you know, full basically AR height optics on top of a rail that sits well above where the barrel actually is, it's just not working for me. Like I said, it wouldn't be an issue for everybody because not everybody has the same vision issues that I do, and there are some people who can run really high offset optics even without a good cheek riser. I'm very well aware of that. I'm just not one of those people. I can't make it work for me. Like I said, 60% of the rounds at 50 yards I could put within 3/4 of an inch. Not bad at all for an AK. But like I said, the other 40% of the rounds, because I just couldn't get a consistent spot behind the gun, they went pretty much every which way, and it was sometimes a struggle to get all 5 or 10 rounds to actually land on an 8-inch target at 50 yards, and that's not encouraging for a rifle. That's definitely not what you want to see. So yeah, I'm definitely going to minimize it and basically tailor it towards what it is actually set up as. For me, like I said, I'm going to take off the fancy red dots and the fancy magnifier, and I'm just going to replace it with a very simple, probably just a very simple shake away 2 MOA dot. Basically transform it into a close quarters gun and just leave it at that, because otherwise I'm going to wind up spending a lot of money on this thing, and the whole reason I got this thing was to avoid spending extra money on modifications after the fact, and so I'm going to stick with that original premise, and I'm just going to knock it down to that, and it'll be my close quarters AK. But like I said, in terms of function, it's flawless. Like I said, no malfunctions of any kind, and I've put several hundred rounds through it now, and it is holding up beautifully. Like I said, I really like the action on this thing. I just turns out going into it, I really should have known, but turns out this really thin triangle stock is really not great for providing a good cheek weld, especially at very high mounted optics. It's kind of a no-duh, but sometimes we have to learn our lessons the hard way. Maybe one of these days I'll find a really cheap stock replacement that has a proper cheek rest on it, and we'll give it another go at distance. But like I said, for now I'm going to knock it down to just a simple 2 MOA red dots and call it good at that. Alright, so that is my update. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know Him, the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.